We should take every opportunity we have to thank our veterans for their service, and today is another one of those opportunities. These men and women are as selfless as they come. Not only did they lay down their lives for their country and the people in it, but when they return or retired from duty, they still do not expect anything in return. They are humble and silent heroes that we tend to take for granted. They offered everything they had for us, and everything we have is because of them. No amount of thanks can measure up to the sacrifice they made, but a heart of gratitude toward these men and women is the least we can offer.
Tears and the orders of the officers appointed over me, according to the regulations of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. So help me God. That's the oath that myself and about 70 other guys took on an April day in 1968. We began a journey that would eventually take us 8,565 miles away from home, to a land and a culture completely different than any we had ever experienced before. Back in 1968, while we did have a standing army, there was a draft that was instituted by the federal government to help assist in a conflict in Vietnam. And of that draft was exposed to guys who perhaps didn't go on to college, perhaps went on to college, but weren't very diligent in their efforts, and their grade level fell below a level that exposed them to the draft. Also, there was a lottery that had been implemented as well. And that lottery consisted of 366 days, also including February 29th, of which when the birthday was called, that soldier who had, or that man who had that birthday, was called up by his draft board and was then enlisted in the military. My training started out at Fort Leonard Wood, where I took my basic training. And some of these guys will correct me, I'm sure, after I'm through talking on the time spans, but anyway, it's been a long time. And, but I had 8 weeks of basic training, and during that time, it was being exposed also to men of different races, different cultures, banded together with one another day and night, showering, shaving, and everything else that included living together with guys. But what it did was, it created camaraderie, it created a team effort. And during that 8 weeks of basic training, all the rigorous physical activity that we had, I think I weighed 230 pounds when I came out of high school, and when I went home I weighed 185. But we banded together, we helped each other out, we picked each other up. When one couldn't make it, we'd pick him up, we'd carry him, and it just taught us how to be team players. From there I went on to a place called Redstone Arsenal, Alabama, where I became an ammunition specialist. And in short, I was responsible for the management, the storage, the dispensing of ammunition to the troops in the field, which is what happened, which was where I took my training into Vietnam. When I got into Vietnam, I'll never forget the day that we landed in Vietnam. And when they opened the door of that plane, if you think Missouri humidity is bad, not a chance. When they opened the door of that plane and we walked out, I mean, it hit me like a ton of bricks. And the other thing that I noticed was, is that being in a completely different culture, a completely different land, there were smells that I had never smelled before. And to this day, I still remember those smells. So as we arrived in Vietnam, we were put into a holding barracks until we went to our platoons and went to our bases that we would be at. And during that time, it was kind of a wait period. We were, as new guys in country, we were expected to pull perimeter guard on one of the nights before we were sent out to our forward support bases. And the fortunate thing, I had fortunate situations all the way through Vietnam, and this was one of them, is that when it was our turn to pull the perimeter guard, or at least a couple of days before, one of the new platoons that went out to pull that guard had encountered some Viet Cong, in that they had turned the claymore mines around on them and then discharged them, and several of the guys were killed. From that time on, they said no more rookies go out, no more new guys go out on these patrols, but it was only the guys who had been in country for some time. As Reagan was telling you that there were 58,000 men killed in Vietnam, there are some other staggering statistics. 2,700,000 were in uniform in Vietnam. 58,000 were killed, 75,000 were severely disabled, 23,000 were 100% disabled, 5,283 lost limbs, 1,081 sustained multiple amputations, 11,465 of those killed were younger than the age of 20. However, the good news is that I can tell you today that 85% of Vietnam veterans made successful transitions to civilian lives. 97% of Vietnam veterans were honorably discharged. 91 of Vietnam veterans say they are glad they served. 74 say they would serve again, even knowing the outcome. And I think I can speak for the guys in this room that we would do it again if we were called to do so. Though there was a sacrifice in Vietnam, the ultimate sacrifice of guys who lost their lives, of guys who were injured severely, of guys who lost limbs, there was another real sacrifice, and that was the time that we came home. You know, when the American soldiers returned home from World War II in 1945, they were greeted as heroes. To honor the returning veterans and recognize the sacrifices that they had made. But the homecoming was very different for most Vietnam vets. We came back to find the United States torn apart by debate over the Vietnam War. There were no victory parades or welcome home rallies. Instead, most of us returned to a society that did not seem to care about us, or that seemed to view us with disgust and anger. And it was true that some were spat on. It was true that some were called baby killers, and they were called other hurtful names. The country was torn over this conflict, and many on college campuses began to protest against the war. Many who fought in Vietnam had a great deal of difficulty readjusting to life in the United States. Some struggled to overcome their physical injuries, emotional problems, drug addictions from the time that they spent in Vietnam. Others had trouble feeling accepted by friends and families. Some blamed their situation on the anti-war movement and developed a deep resentment toward anti-war protesters. But then again, many began to question the war and our own actions in it. In fact, some vets protested against the war once they returned to the United States. But those vets felt that they had earned the right to question the government's policies, while college students were protesting all over the country, didn't have the right. But they did as Americans. They had a right to protest. That's what we were there for, is to give them that right and give them that liberty. Some veterans returned from Vietnam with severe physical disabilities or emotional problems. The Vietnam War had a much higher ratio of wounded to killed soldiers than any previous war. Faster evacuation of wounded soldiers from battlefields and advances in medical treatment meant that more men survived combat injuries. But it also meant that more veterans came home with serious crippling injuries, such as amputated limbs and paralysis. In addition, many American soldiers used hard drugs during their service in Vietnam. Drugs such as marijuana, opium, and heroin were cheap and easy to obtain. Drug addiction continued to be a problem among veterans when they returned home. To make matters worse, the U.S. government at first denied that some of the vets' health problems were related to their service in Vietnam. For example, many veterans developed mental and emotional problems as they struggled to cope with feelings about the war. Many suffered from symptoms including depression, guilt, flashbacks, nightmares, mood swings, angry outbursts, anxiety, and paranoias. Doctors eventually gave this condition a name. They called it post-traumatic stress syndrome and recognized it as a real physical, psychological illness. Some had illnesses that were related to chemicals used to defoliate the jungle, as Agent Orange. This chemical caused many illnesses, such as cancer and heart disease. Since most of the soldiers who served in Vietnam were very young and came from working-class families, they did not have access to private health care in the United States. Instead, they had to depend on the U.S. government to provide them with treatment and rehabilitation. Unfortunately, the government agency charged with caring for veterans, called the Veterans Administration, did not do a good job of helping the Vietnam veterans. Many of the VA hospitals where they received treatment were dirty, understaffed, and unable to provide what veterans needed. Much has changed since then. And I use the VA on a regular basis, and I can tell you that the services and the treatments that they give are exceptional. The facilities are exceptional. We have come a long way as far as veterans are concerned and the treatment of their wounds and their injuries. Many veterans did have a tough time readjusting to life in the United States after they completed their military service, just as it is today with returning soldiers from Afghanistan and Iraq. Many veterans went from the jungles of Vietnam to their hometowns so quickly that it took weeks for soldiers to be discharged and transported home. U.S. soldiers often returned from Vietnam within 2 days. Returning to the safety and comfort of home so quickly made it difficult for them to make sense of the danger and misery they experienced in Vietnam. Not all was gloom and doom. Vietnam vets built successful lives after they returned home. Many finished their educations, established good careers, and had families. By the 1980s, excuse me, many Americans began to change their views of Vietnam veterans. They began to see that even if the war was wrong, most of us who fought it were just ordinary guys doing their jobs. Many people started to feel sympathy and even gratitude toward the veterans. Soldiers who had served in Vietnam finally began receiving the recognition and marching in holiday parades across the country. As we celebrate those who are actively serving today in our military, along with those who have served, it is very appreciated that people tell a military man or woman, "Thank you for your service." When seeing a military man or woman, our veterans, I would urge you to say to them, "Never forget." This expression shows that you are engaged with them today and that you understand and appreciate their sacrifices and their service. So to all of you, thank you so much for this recognition, for this tribute. Continue to stand with your country. And as I first started this talk out, I said, to preserve and protect the Constitution of the United States, to obey the orders of the President of the United States and those that he has put in authority under us, over us. Remember that. That's what we're here for. That's what the United States of America stands for. God bless you, and God bless the United States.